Welcome to the Kaiser Neuromap Masterclass for summer 2021. And the topic today will be encephalization. Here we're watching a sperm whale pass by. And the reason why I bring up the sperm whale is because it's got the largest brain on Earth. The largest ever found was 9.2 kilograms. The average is more around 8 kilograms, but you can see how big that brain is. And so it comes down to one of the first things in studying the brain is just understanding the size matter. And one of the things is why there aren't so many, not every creature has a large brain, is because brains are metabolically expensive. They're like use 10 times more energy and resources than typical tissue. So they must show a benefit to pay off that expense. Okay, so you'll hear sometimes of two forms of encephalization. Most of the encephalization we're talking about is phylogenetic encephalization, philo across species, across groups. Ontogenetic, within a lifespan, that's also called developmental encephalization, where the brain increases in size during fetal development and also even will get bigger once the baby is born. But we care more about this encephalization that we see across species, where the large brain creatures such as ourselves are relatively new to the planet. Only a few million years if you count the ape-sized brains, and the whales, I guess going back maybe 40 million years, you have large brains. But typically in our species, last 200,000 years or so, or less for the size we have. And you can see the variety of brain sizes there. Okay, so does brain size reflect intelligence? Well, if you were an alien coming in from Alpha Centauri or Vega or wherever you're coming from, and you had specimens of the various creatures living on Earth, and you had their brains in formaldehyde jars, and you decide, okay, I'm going to go try to communicate with a species, which one do you think would be smarter? Well, look at the bottlenose dolphin. At first glance, you say, well, this one looks smarter than this species because for one, it's larger, but the body size is larger. If you took a microscope to them, you would maybe go back to the humans, because you'd notice that this is much more thin. There's fewer cells. It's thinner, less than half the width of much of the human neocortex. So it's down to even like a third in places. So let's look at the, if we look at absolute brain size and think you get smarter as it gets larger, you'd have to explain this fin whale in here. Fin whale are they're baleen whales. They just graze through the sea like cows grazing in grass. They graze through the sea on krill. And elephants would show up, but they 4 times smarter at least than humans, and we would be 3 times smarter. But you can't. They have to control much bigger bodies. These creatures down here. That's why their brain has to get larger to control all that other tissue. So one of the ways to do is look at not the absolute, but the relative. And you'll see in much of science, relative measures are better than absolute. For one, it's hard to really get an absolute measure in many phenomenon. But relative is you're allowing a lot of issues to fall away when you do relative comparisons than when you do absolute comparisons. And you can see this relative comparison seems pretty reasonable. Aristotle knew about this. In proportion to his size, man has the largest brain of all the animals and the moistest. Maybe moistest in that human brains, when they were studied, the person had just passed away, and where the other ones had dried out. So I don't think this moistness is an issue. But okay, let's go back over here to the percentage, and you can see we're at 2.1% of our body weight on average, which would make us maybe almost twice as smart as the dolphins, 3 times as smart as the chimpanzees, if this was a pure measure of relative brain size to body reflects intelligence. However, going down this list, all of a sudden we get the cows, and that's why the cows, they're smarter than the sperm whale, and we know sperm whales, they hunt with echolocation. They found sperm whale with a deformed jaw and still was relatively healthy, showing that didn't even need to It wasn't the biting as much as the stunning it was doing with that echolocation. In fact, people who swim with sperm whales will say after a while you'll start to feel your body heating up from all that energy. And in fact, the sperm whale can make the loudest sound of any creature. I think it's like 200 something decibels. So, well, the cow shouldn't be smart unlisted smarter, at least not even, definitely not 4 times smarter. That's why they're looking at Excel, like I said. But so we got to do a little bit more of trying to get a better relative measure. This is a quick relative measure. So there's one that this man, Harry Jerrison, invented in 1977 called the encephalization quotient. And this is even more of a relative measure of brain size by taking one single typical mammal and expanding it in size or contracting in size to meet this average size of other species and see, okay, if you expand so much, how much is the brain expanding? And now with that comparison, you can see is what brain size of your comparison species is to your typical. And they use the cat as this typical species. And the argument is that your brain mass is this brain needed to control the body, and anything that's left over is it's part of the intelligence. So here's the encephalization quotient. You'll see it's different numbers depending. Sometimes they'll remove fat layers because they deal with a lot of whales. But I think this is the fat-free one. Sometimes they include it, sometimes they don't, so the numbers will vary. But you can see we top the list. Bottlenose dolphins come in much closer, and then killer whales and chimps. And here's the cat. And the one thing you'll notice about all these creatures below the cat, and maybe even including cat, the smaller brain, the smaller encephalization quotient, none of these are real social animals. They may be herd animals, but they're not really as social like all these creatures are. These all have to deal with other members of their species, conspecifics. And this shows the dog is actually smarter than the cat. The cat's playing checkers, and that's why the dog can play chess. There's other things you learn about in terms of like dogs. Recently, there's a paper showing that if you doing this study where the owner of the dog was either helped or not helped by a human, and then they saw how the dog responded to the person who didn't help, and showed that the dog resisted approaching or expecting anything positive from the person who didn't help his owner. Cats could not make that distinction. So showing that dogs were plotting or modeling social information better than cats. All right, here's a nice view of a lot of the dolphins have much bigger brains. Part of it could be all the fish oil. They eat a lot of fish, so need a lot of lipids, fatty acids to have these larger brains. And you see we are much different than our genetic close cousins here. And this is a nice little image of the encephalization quotient compared to the absolute size. And here you're getting like one of the grazers in the ocean. That's blue whale. And there's the sperm whale. But you can see that these vary, and that encephalization is still below humans. So, and this has been going on, this encephalization process across species, within species, for millions of years. In fact, this is a nice summary of life on Earth in terms of brain development. If you look at the archaic mammals, those are and the archaic reptiles, including the dinosaurs, you can see these large bodied creatures, I should say. But over time, over the 40 million or 65 million or more years, the reptile and dinosaur clade or group has not changed its relationship to its brain. It's not gotten smarter, where all the mammals have gotten more brainy. One of the things that's also happened is that all these large reptiles have been replaced by the mammals. They have been eaten out of their homes, in essence, because they did not get smarter. And the ones that remain are only in niches that really the mammals don't want to invade, such as swamps ambush predators, deserts and swamps. You don't really need to get smarter to be able to live in an environment where all you have to do is look for anything to change in your environment. If it moves, go after it. If you think you can eat it and it not hurt you. So you can see this, what they call neural arms races, happen in the mammals only. And what has happened, because the reptiles have stayed in their ways of their brain. In fact, I'm showing reptiles from 40 million years ago. You can see they haven't changed. That's a current picture, but that could have been from 40 million years ago. They have, in terms of their brain integration development, they have limited intercortical connectivity and reduced cortical hippocampal connectivity. And that means that they don't learn very well. They rely mostly on instincts, where mammals learn. So, and that's why they are not able to hold on to the niches that they used to hold on to. The mammals took those over, and only these remain. All right, so this arms race that has happened in mammals, you can see it in the grazing animals, ungulates like water buffalo and so forth, and the carnivores. As in the past, they had less. This is their EQ. They had smaller brains on average than their current ones, but you can see this is a nice distribution. But the carnivores have gotten large as well. And in fact, the reason why the ungulates have gotten large is because those who were able to learn or get larger died off. And the arms race is primarily in the social mammals. It deals with sociality. You can see this is how the percent of stability of groups versus the rate of encephalization. You have this reasonable, strong relationship between stability of groups and bigger brains. So it's largely in those mammals that survive through social functioning. All right, and when things larger brains, they need to learn the world. And how do you learn the world? Through play. That's through trial and error. And there's a nice study that looked at the encephalization quotient and the rate of play, and you see it's a very strong relationship. That the bigger the quotient, the more playtime. So having a large brain enables environmental manipulation, tool use, symbol processing, and social behavior. For instance, this is actually spontaneous tool use by dolphins out there in Western Australia. They have stinging fish out there, and what they do is they grab this coral, put it around their rostrum there. We might think is their nose, their rostrum, and that way that coral will protect them from stinging fish. So with stinging fish, they approach stinging fish, the fish will just sting this coral and then come around and be eaten by the dolphins. So this is spontaneous tool use. And they've had dolphins be able to learn with these lexigram, these tools that do yes and no, answer that way, answer to sign language. In fact, I briefly worked out there at this lab. It's no longer going on, but they were doing sign language research, and they even were trying phonetic languages with the dolphins, not human speech, but like different sounds that refer to different categories. But it was difficult for them to maintain that ability. But sign language seemed to be pretty good at it. Okay, so does this larger brain give us more consciousness, this larger encephalization quotient, I should say, gives us more consciousness, more awareness of internal and external existence? Because we know, for instance, that young babies and toddlers are not as conscious as the bigger brained, children are. And one of the ways they test consciousness is what's called the Rouge test, or the mirror test. They put a red dot on an animal, usually when it's been anesthetized. So when it wakes up, it doesn't know it has a red dot. It doesn't have any memory of being touched there. But then they have mirrors, and they see how the animal deals with that red dot on their forehead, typically, or here on a baby's put on its nose to see if it notices. And you can see it doesn't know that mirror corresponds with him or her. Right now, it's trying to interact like it's another child. So the mirror test is interesting in terms of brain size. Most of the large brain mammals, most of the large brain primates, I should say, they are successful at the mirror test. The gorillas don't seem to be being successful. The only one gorilla was Coco, who had learned sign language and was much more interactive. And it might also be gorillas fail when you put a red dot on their forehead. They don't care, even though they see it. It isn't something they worry about. But cats, some dogs, there's been some question about it, but usually cats and dogs fail. Octopus may fail. Again, it may be how important it is to inspect that red dot or black dot or whatever they put on the forehead or the area where they can see. And bottlenose dolphins, though, will keep expecting and looking at that spot more so, self-orient, same thing as orcas and elephants. But then you get this all other creatures, birds. But birds are kind of unusual that they often are smarter than they look in that they a lot of times have reasonably high encephalization quotients. Okay. So just to give you an example of trying to figure out if an elephant has awareness, self-awareness, well, the first level would be, is it aware of how it exists in the body? And just watch this elephant, and you'll see that it understands, not only understands, but can duplicate a representation of itself. And you can see it's following the lines, and you see when it goes back, it'll follow that line. It knows what it's doing. It's intentional action. So here you'd say definitely the elephant has a strong form of consciousness that it can. It will have it finish up its plant or flower there. All right, but then it can draw a painting, a depiction of itself, shows that it is aware of it, of what it looks like. That's a good sign of consciousness. Okay, now one of the most interesting things about brains, and even those that may not be fully conscious, before they even have sort of like self-awareness, they have social fairness. And we see in this beautiful study done by DeWall, who was studying capuchin monkeys, they have this basic task where the monkey has to give a rock from inside its cage there to the experimenter. And once they get the rock, they get a cucumber the first time they do it, and they're fine with the cucumber. They start eating it, and it's not a problem. And then when the second monkey, the one on the right, does the exact same task, gets a rock from inside the cage and hands it over. That second monkey gets a grape, which is much more valued reward. And so then now we're actually looking at, now that that's happened once, we're looking at the second time where now this monkey has seen that this other one gets a grape, does the same task a second time, hands the rock to the experimenter, but gets a cucumber, doesn't get a grape. And in its belief and its outrage, it throws a cucumber back at the experimenter. That's what you're seeing here. So this unfairness. It was completely fine the very first time before it knew that it could really get a grape, or any animal could get a grape for doing this task. It was fine eating the cucumber, but it was once it saw that its partner over here, its cellmate, got a grape, it expected a grape as well, and when it didn't, it was outraged. Okay, and so that's in 52 grams. That's how big the brain is. So our brain, 25 times bigger. So fairness detection is very important in social creatures. It's all about reciprocal relationships. Okay, so in our brain, we've gotten bigger very quickly in the last 2 million years in particular. That's what this is showing, how in terms of the brain has gotten so much bigger very quickly. Last 500,000 years, last 200,000 years. And it's really 4 leaps of braininess. This is the mammal line of the it's not encephalization quotient. This is now brain size compared to body mass, but it's a reasonable representation. Again, when doing relative comparisons. So here's the mammal average. Here's the primate. That's the first leap. Then the Australopithecus, second leap. Then the hominids about 2 million years ago. And you can see Neanderthal has bigger brain, but we even leap over this direction. As you head towards this direction, that's smarter to the top left. And so 4 leaps in braininess. That does result in the bigger our brain, the more time it takes for it to mature, the more dependency the younger uh, children have. Okay, so what was fueling this braininess? And was it one of the theories out there is the lava ape, the idea that it was these lava fields allowed food to be cooked so that we didn't need to have as much energy used in our digestion, and our guts got smaller, and that energy savings could be used for larger brains. That's one of the theories out there of maybe what drove it. Climate change seems to be very important. This is the volatility of the temperature, and our brain is going to get bigger here. As things get more volatile, there's more challenges. More challenges, the smarter creatures survive, and less smarter do not. And the smarter ones are able to pass on their genes. And so, with more volatility in temperature and climate change, you have more pressure for intelligence. This is a beautiful summary of climate and evolution, and I love this one here. I don't have. Oh, there's the citation. Beautiful summary of up to about 1.5 million years ago, and there were multiple hominid species on planet Earth till just recently. And you can see behaviorally, there's the stone tools compared to 1.7. It's much more manufactured. The type of tooth tells you the carbon. It can tell you you have what's called a gracile, which is the more thinner, smarter creatures versions of a species, and the robust versions that are the stronger, brawnier, less intelligent. And the brawnier apes are usually what I like to call the bamboo chewers, like gorillas. And it's the gracile that eventually become the omnivores. Go after the eat meat as well as vegetation. This shows maybe the pressure from the climate variability and the change in the East Africa where all these are being found, these fossils. And when you have the high variability in all these light purple areas, and that's resulting in that pressure towards more intelligence. Okay, so you can see multiple species, like literally Earth's almost like experimenting and creating a human species about every 500,000 years. And we had 3 recently on planet Earth, as recent as maybe 25, 30,000 years ago. But now we stand alone. And one of the last species to die out is the Neanderthals, but did it really die out? Because we know many of us have Neanderthal genes. Up to like 4% of our genes can be Neanderthal. You can see they're bigger. They have bigger brains, organized differently. You can see how this is more, just you can see that how it's elongated. This one's more compact. There's probably a lot more going on in terms of language ability and more complexity in our, especially in the vocal controls. We also had the Denosovans, recently discovered species. This is a sort of a model of what they happen. And then we had this Erectus one, or even I guess it's pre-Erectus. That was the hobbit they found out there in Indonesia a few years ago. But you can see we had a bunch of different species recently. And then there was one. What causes it sometimes with speciation, when you see a species takes over a whole land mass or niche, but eventually to get speciation, you got to get separation, geographic separation. And one of the things, glaciers may have separated what would become the Denosovans versus the Neanderthals. And here's where the hobbit was down here in Indonesia. But look at all, and there's probably more. There'll be more. They'll find more. Sometimes they'll regroup. It used to be in the past when we found a hominid skull, we just assumed it was one of our ancestors, but now we realize a lot of these have died off and weren't directly our ancestors. they had evolved some too. Well, another thing may have happened in the last couple 100,000 years. There may have been an aquatic stage called the Aquatic Ape Theory, and it is to explain a lot of the weird characteristics, such as our lack of hair on our body, our bipedalness, the fat layers, and even most important, voluntary control of breathing, because you wouldn't have speech without voluntary control. The only voluntary breathers out there are the marine mammals, because they need to have that to be able to survive in that environment. And you can see that there's all kinds of elements that support that we may have had a coastal era during our recent speciation, maybe down in South Africa, is like 100,000 years ago, and where we became more focused on fish and oysters and other kinds of coastal food sources. And those of us who were born with more fat and less hair that drag us down were better at foraging in the coastal areas or the lakes or wherever it may be, and that helped all these features emerge. Pretty controversial theory, because you can't find fossils near water or in water. they deteriorate. So where you find the fossils, this is in dry places like East Africa. Can't find the fossils in the coastal areas or the submerged coasts, because of the water has actually risen up in our time, so that you can't find the fossils. You make a theory based on the evidence you see, but this is other evidence of all these features that really only makes sense if we had this aquatic stage. And it wasn't like we turned into dolphins, we just more swam around a lot and walked around a lot in the water. Okay, there's all kinds of elements. If you look up the Aquatic Ape Theory, you can find all the various adaptations. It seems that we are meant that one day, part of our life, our evolution was spent in a water environment or near on the coast. Okay, now recently, this is our belief, our model of how humans have populated the planet. We started out in Africa, and there were various dispersions, like Homo erectus went out of Africa, maybe 100,000 years ago, 200,000 years ago, and then evolved into like Neanderthal and Denisovans, and here's the path. And the most recent thing is the recognition that with the genetic studies, there's some interesting, they're finding genes out here in the Amazon that come from the Denisovans and the other islanders, and there may even been this Lutrian hypothesis, because the Native Americans of around 13,000 years ago, most of the finds that are out here on the East Coast. They're called Clovis because they're found out here in New Mexico, Clovis, New Mexico, but they're actually mostly out here on the East Coast, and they resemble the same kind of stonework that you see in the Spanish groups called the Salustrians. So that may have happened, and it may have been even some other passages up north, because there's not a clear picture. There may have been that this was even populated maybe 40,000 years ago, because we get some people down here even 30,000 years ago that may have some European qualities, and then the Asiatic Native Americans took them over, as we often see, as we've seen over in Europe about 8,000 years ago. The steppes people migrated all over the place and took over much of the spaces on the West Europe. Okay, another thing that's probably happened we know it's happened to the planet and may have affected us, is that we may have, the standard story is around 9,000 to 10,000 years. We started doing agriculture, was invented, and began to domesticate plants and various animals for our food sources. But that may not have been the first time that happened. There's interesting evidence that we actually are living in civilization version 2.0, or maybe 3.0 even. But definitely, we may have gotten reasonably advanced in the past, and then comets came in and wiped it all out. We had a sudden change in temperature, could have happened over a single day, perhaps. We had, in essence, a a drop, sudden drop, and then a sudden rise pretty much after that. And we see some unusual technology, a usual commonality that, like for instance, pyramids on almost every continent. Um, and they have machine tooling, evidence that there was machine tooling like lathes going on, and possibly electrical lights or some kind of light source that's inside that's not based on like torches. And this is Gopeki Tempe, which is a find from around this strike. Um, so, so this is actually there's the drop going towards this time. Here's the current time here, and there's a sudden rise. And how do you explain a sudden rise? One of the ways is to think it was comets hitting the Earth thousands of years ago, 9600 BC, and then possibly before that at like 12,000 BC or 14,000 years ago, 13.5. Okay, well, that just to recognize that we have a model. And a lot of times our models about humanity is based on what's the available evidence, and you got to be use intelligence to figure out, okay, maybe the evidence such as for the aquatic apes theory, they it does doesn't fossilize. We don't have the fossils but we have this other types of evidence of our nature. And the same thing with the genes, until there's been this argument that it was all these Asiatic, it was the Bering Strait that allowed the Asiatic natives to populate the entire Americas. But then we find DNA from Europeans out here, and then Denisovans out here, and Islanders. Okay. Oh, some other things that may have happened, some freaky things. Oh, the freakiest thing is this one here, is how did they have this is like something from at least 800 years, 800 AD, maybe before that. It looks like pretty much a stegosaurus or a dinosaur here. How would they have known a dinosaurs? Even if they saw the bones, like a fossilized, it wouldn't look like this. So how could they have seen that unless they were alive? And you do see that in the Bible, the mention of Leviathan and other creatures, that there may have been some dinosaurs walking around much more recently than we thought. But that's just one of the things, just to show you that the world is not maybe as known, and our history is not as known as we may think. Also, the sun can be a damaging force, and it looks like we went through a time where a lot of people dig underground cities to live in, or towns or villages, I should say. And first, how they do this with just chisels and tools, especially if it's a Bronze Age, using weak metals. They have to use pretty strong metals. So there's probably was machines tooling going on. There's this interesting, what's called a high current Z pinch that results from I think it's from a blast from the sun, sending out a matter of, and it comes in the like North Pole, and it creates this image in the sky. And there's all kinds of drawings from all different cultures showing this would probably happen. And there's evidence in various places of like scorching. There could have been these mass ejections, they call, from the sun, and they made enough of them that people had to go underground to survive. All right. So, and the last part, the last part of unusual from the story is the Paracan skulls and these other large brain skulls. And even when they do the DNA test with the Paracans, which is only one person out there, Brian Forster, doing that that I know of, finding DNA that's not all human, or from some unknown human species, some ghost species that somebody's called. But okay, so that's the last little mystery. But here's a question: can the human brain get any bigger? So if we did a plot of our brain, our relative encephalization level, as we approach the current moment, it's been getting bigger and bigger and bigger. Well, the one thing is, and we've had bigger brains with the Neanderthals, but the one thing is, what limits it is that this brain has to get out of the mother. So currently, nature's come up with the solution of sending out the fetus when it's almost still a fetus. An newborn is much more immature compared to other mammals, like how a fawn will be born and be able to walk in like 20 minutes. It'll get on its legs, and it takes forever for an infant to start walking. So in essence, If we were like the other large large brain mammals, such as the elephant or the killer whale, their gestation period for a similar brain size is 2 years. So being pregnant for 2 years, it might be possible, but then how do you get that baby out of that uh, through the pelvis? And so nature's technique is, okay, let's do some of that expansion of the brain of the head outside the womb, and they expel the infant when it's very younger than other species, in essence. In fact, chimps have a gestation of almost 9 months. It's like 8.5 months. So very similar, even though they have much smaller, 1/3 the size brain. So nature has come up with a solution and that's expelling, and that helplessness of the newborn changed our species, and how we have male and female bonding in a way that other primates don't, because of that helplessness of the baby that causes helplessness with the mother, and then she has to find a reliable um, partner for sustenance. Okay, so generally in encephalization, we've seen these 6 features occur, where we see a relative increase in brain size over time. We see a relative increase in what's called the telencephalon, the cortex in essence, over time compared to the other ones, the hindbrain, the midbrain. Relative increase in the representation of sensory information over motor response, and that's mostly talking about how we go from the more primitive mammals in brain organization to the primates and cetaceans. We have more and more tissue dedicated to sensory processing, and relative to the motor tissue dedicated to motor response. Relative increase in the cortex involved in associative integration compared to reception, primary, what's called the primary areas. Our primary areas are these little areas like back here, and there's one here for the auditory. In the cat, the primary area is pretty much as big as the association area, but you can see our primary areas there's a lot of association tissue there, non-primary. This is a primary too, right there. That's for motor and somatosensory. Okay, greater differentiation of the neocortex in terms of cell diversity and general cell organization, what we call like Brodmann areas, and relative importance of the biophysical senses over the chemical senses in the smarter species, and such as in dolphins and humans, and in the primates, compared to the carnivores, are more focused on chemical senses. All right, so what is the benefit did our big brain provide? Did it let us be able to master our environment more, or master ourselves and our social groups more? And when I was growing up, I always was told that our brain not only is in absolute numbers is bigger than other primates, such as the chimpanzee, but I was told that our frontal lobe in particular is takes up much more room in our brain than it does in other primates and other creatures. Well, that's not exactly true. It's our frontal lobe, in terms of absolute, sure, we're much bigger in terms of absolute. It's like 4 times bigger in absolute size. Relative size, though, you see, it's like at 37%, 38%, and the other ones are comparable. Only when you get to the monkeys here do you get down below 30. So very similar proportionally in terms of how much tissue is dedicated to the frontal lobe. And you can see it here, that it's not a runaway. This is like the frontal lobe here. This is the inside, the medial view. And you can see how much of, how big it is this is when compare of the brain. And you can see it's similar. Chimpanzees and monkeys, it's about the same amount of red there. But in absolute size, you can see, much, much bigger. So their numbers mean something too. So size does matter to some degree. But specialization, cell diversity is very interesting. It's one of the most interesting topics you can do in neuroscience, is look at cell diversity and what's going on in terms of the different types of cells. And we have one type of cell called the spindle cell, also it's sometimes called, for the person who first really well described it, von Economo cells, but spindle cells is easier to say. And I usually see written as spindle cells. They are these large pyramidal neurons located primarily in the anterior cingulate, some in the frontal insula, some in they find in area 9, Brahmin area 9, which we're going to talk about all the Brahmin areas as this masterclass continues. But pyramidal neurons uh, dominate all the neocortex, but the spindle cells dominate these tissues, these areas in particular. And you can see we have many more spindle cells than in terms of volume here than in any of these other apes, other primates. Okay, so some interesting differences. That's kind of, they call this a bipolar morphology. The spindle cell has like a large axon and a large dendrite, and compared to the single axon and multiple dendrites of most pyramidal neurons. And we also have some the bat cells as well. Those are involved in motor function, and the other creatures do have them as well. But in terms of spindle cells, they have been found in large brain species such as the elephants and whales, but they were missing in most mammals and most primates except for the apes. So you can see there, they believe they may be involved in implicating self-control and social emotional intelligence. And the reason why we think that is because when they start to deteriorate, we see it in various disorders such as Alzheimer and the loss of that social emotional intelligence or self-control. Also in development, as the area gets more spindle cells during your development, you get more self-control. So there's also developmental evidence for what these cells are likely doing. So you see the spindle cells are selective vulnerability in neurodegenerative processes such as Alzheimer, frontotemporal dementia, schizophrenia, and closal agenesis, when you don't have a corpus callosum does not emerge. This is looking at the ability of multitasking and how the bigger your anterior cingulate with these spindle cells, the better you will be at multitasking. You see here is reduction in volume in those who have Alzheimer's, the black dots compared to those in the white dots. You have this loss of gray matter and other things going on, such as volume and metabolic activity is reduced in depression and autistics in different parts of the ACC, the anterior cingulate cortex. You see an excessive activation in OCD. Okay, so these are one of the unique elements, and there's some more there's other distribution differences in terms of like brain areas, how they divided. We'll be talking about how they created 52 Brahmin areas, but there are actually more areas in monkeys than in humans. But those divisions are sort of arbitrary. The spindle cell, and to a lesser point, these bat cells are pretty unique to humans, but spindle cells are at least in mostly in our genetic neighbors. All right, so why did we get smarter? And they have what they call the Machiavellian hypothesis, is that our brain got bigger because we had to deal with other creatures, others of our species, be able to understand social information. And when you look at the 80 or so primates out there, and they all have reasonably large brains compared to other mammals, they want to say, okay, well, how are they paying that for that expensive tissue? Must be paying off somehow. And one of the ways is look at, okay, is there any correlation between the relative size of the neocortex and some behavioral aspects, such as how much territory the animal covers, or how much they have to rely on color vision. How sensitive can their color vision have to be because they eat fruit where color is very important to know if it's ripe or sour or rotten. How much distance you travel to forage for your food, or how hard it is to extract food from whatever your food source is. Well, none of those correlate across the 80 species of primates with the brain size. So it doesn't explain brain size, or was not the pressure that led to the larger brain size. Where is the pressure? It's in group size. It's how many people you can handle. And the more people you can handle, in essence, the more faces, more people you know, the more successful you can be, because you can use the membership of the group to succeed and achieve successes that could not be achieved without large groups or larger groups. So our group size is around 150. When you plug us into this plot us into the relationship between group size and neocortical, relative neocortical size. And to explain 150, it isn't that we know every aspect of those 150 people we should know. Our brain expects to grow up in a tribe of about 150 people, but you'll have an inner group you can call here. It's called a support clique, um, and those will be the ones who you really depend on, and they depend on you. And the sympathy group is a little bit larger. Usually, I don't see it go up to normal 15, but a lot of times you see it from like 8 to 10, but it could go up to 15 in some individuals. And that's the amount of people, their successes and their failures are your own, meaning that you feel empathy for them. And when they are successful, you feel good. And when they are not, you feel bad. And the same for them. They have a reciprocal relationship of that you have a shared sympathy with each other. Then you have like your affinity group. Probably you can think of those as the people, the colleagues and rivals in your field, professional field. Maybe might be also people, the places, the haunts you go to, the various people you see at your regular stops. And then what they call the affiliate network, and that would be probably the more people you do know a little bit about, what it is to really talk about a group size is when you see a person, what do you know about that person's relationship with another person? Do you, like, if you see a person, if you see Tom, does he know Jane or not? So you see Tom and Jane together, what's your understanding of their relationship? And you should know about 150 people in terms of a few aspects of who they know. And that would be the 150 faces that our brain expects to develop in. That's a better representation of it. Well, you can see that we don't live typically around 150 people. We live more around 1,500 people or 15,000 people, and we've left the village life. We've left the tribes for townships and cities. But we can see if that 150 number is still valid by just looking at those cultures where they still live in villages in what I'm calling pre-township. And if you look at how people congregate in these various cultures, you can see it's around 150. Very cool. There's other validation in terms of military group size. What's the most functional? The way to think about it, 150 people can police themselves with face-to-face contact. But after you get more than 150 people, you need a formal group. You need the police to deal with social issues and problems that emerge. Well, the 150 person limit shows up in many problems. And one of the examples is school shootings. 20 years ago, when Columbine happened, one of the things that I was most upset by was how big the school was. When I saw all those kids filing out of that school, it was hundreds and hundreds. And my school had about 1/4 of the size. And what you do see is that 150 number. If you look at the grade size, and the grade size is going to be people you're relating to on a daily basis, who you're in essence in competition for various resources in the school and in the environment. That 150 number is a good divider. It shows that most of these school shootings, random school shootings, happen in larger schools, those above 150. Here's an example of data of schools things were reverted. There's the 150 number. And why do we have these large schools? It wasn't just because of population. A lot of people just think, oh, well our population has increased, and it has increased from 25 million students to nearly 50 million. But that means our schools should be twice as crowded as they used to be. But they're even worse than that because they shut the schools down. In the last 60 years, this is data from 20 years ago, but you see this reduction in the number of schools, these mega schools. And the problem with the mega school is that our brain expects a much more intimate environment, to know people around us. And you can see this is going on. This is actually 20 years old. It's probably worse now, but most people are, depending on what environment you're in, are in large schools that have large grades. Imagine you're competing against 400 other faces when you're a teenager and when you're creating your emotional social identity. And that's how difficult it is. And only in the rural environments do you get smaller, smaller groups. And this has an impact on your academic achievement. So this is again a relative measure. Absolute would be obvious, absolute, because these are bigger numbers. But when you make it relative, it still is worse. There's more dropouts as the school gets bigger. And there's an even change in our academic functioning. This is a different score, another relative measure where we showing the improvement in math from 8th to 12th grade, and the maximum improvement happens around that 150 size. When you get larger groups, you get less achievement because who you are doesn't matter to the group. We matter to the group when our group is about 150. When we have more than 150, we do not matter, not nearly as much. And so what does dense population do? It actually impacts our right hemisphere, the responsible for our self-awareness. And when you have the right hemisphere is involved in a lot of social, emotional, and self issues. And that gets impacted and literally gets slowed in its development when you have too many people. And one of the ways you can see this is we have a very quick right hemisphere ability or perception task. And if you look at this, it's called the street test, named after the street who created it in the 40s. Just what is this object? Well, that's a sailboat. Most people can see that. What is this? Most people can see that one. That is a dog, probably a Dalmatian, but it could be just any breed there. What is this? This is harder for most people, for a lot of people to see. This is a rabbit. And the hardest one is this one. Most people, only about 5% of people will see this. And only those people who are right hemisphere dominant in their perception will see that. Left brain people who are dominant, you typically see this and maybe this one. They have trouble here. And then right brain dominant will see, only those will see this. And this is a knight on horseback. And with the right hemisphere, you have to use the parts to see the holes. You can't, the left hemisphere is reducing things just to parts. What is the core category? And you could never figure out by just looking at the part what that is. That's a hoof. You can never figure that out in isolation. It's in relation to the other parts, and that's what the right hemisphere is good at. Here's another version of the test. This has more visual noise, so it means there's some shading there that isn't part of the object. But if you can see the object, it means your right hemisphere is more has not been slowed in its development by all the population density we face. And it is a faucet that you might see on the edge of a house. Okay, so years ago I did a study where I took this street test of 10 items. This is just to let you know what they are. That's a bird, that's a violin, there's the dog again, man on a horse, sprinter. Some people think that looks like a monkey. There's the rabbit. That's the knight on the horse. That's a boxing match. There's the boxing gloves. That's a man and a woman hugging. And that is a baseball game going on. It's a batter, catcher, and umpire. So I gave this quick street test to all these students who were taking an intro psych class. They were all engineering students. They were at the technology school I was at, and very well controlled in terms of age, pretty much the same age, 18, 19, and 20, small little range. And they were all there as going to engineering majors, going to school. And I had them tell me, answer this test, and then give me what year they graduated and what was their high school. And then I just looked up their graduating class sizes and compared the results. 100% would be getting all 10 correct. And you can see the ones who are in the smallest schools, and this data has been smoothed. It's not this beautiful. It's been smooth, average, I should say. Smooth is what it's called. Got about 7 of the 10 right if they had a school of about 90. And then as the school got bigger and bigger in the grade size, so 90 would be a school of 360 people. Like 100 grade size would mean a high school typically of 400 people. Sometimes high schools will only have 3 grades, but it's the grade size that we're most focused on. And you can see as it gets down to, you get half, you get, what is that, 40% reduction, or it's a reduction to 50% ability if you had a very large school. And so large schools impede social emotional development. They've known this since the 60s. And we all know, well, people have known that small schools are much more successful in almost everything they do. In fact, anything that's even like the larger schools maybe do better, the results used to be thought the SATs would be better, but now they seem to be about the same. But all these other abilities, all this social development and emotional development is fostered by the smaller schools. Less absenteeism, more athletic participation, students more satisfied, the parents are more committed. Now that's a weird thing. How can you have a small school and that results in the parents being committed? Because you have to think about how that happened. Is that they have this pressure for the schools to merge. The federal government will bribe schools to really merge. They'll pay part of their bill longer time, but the parents stopped it, and those are the ones that stopped it and kept the schools smaller. That now we're seeing what's going. Now they're in the smaller school, and they're showing that commitment that they showed earlier when they stopped it from becoming a larger school. My kids actually were in a school, Churchville Chi-Li. Churchville, small school, beautiful elementary school. It's really small, 60 kids in each grade. But then by fifth grade, they merged with the Chi-Li, which is a town of 40,000. Churchville is a town of 1,800. And so you went from having a town of 1,800 with its school system and its high school and everything, joining with this huge city, or a reasonable sized city, I should say. And it resulted in these very large schools, grade sizes of 400 and more. Okay, and the teachers also like it in smaller schools because they can only handle about 150 faces. So the right hemisphere schools inhibit right hemisphere development. The larger schools, I said. I'm going to say right hemisphere schools. The larger schools are really left hemisphere schools. They inhibit the right hemisphere development, which is opposed to social emotional functioning when it's critical, diminishes our identity and our sense of a unique self. We don't feel unique when there's so many competing faces out there. Our brain expected to be in a small village, surrounded by 150 people who know us for all our life, with maybe a few births and deaths mixing up the population, but people knowing, everyone around us would typically know us. And that we keep our mind in this sort of public way. But with this large groups of people, we now create this private model of our mind, which we call self-consciousness. And that just emerged probably 3,000 years ago, 2,600 years ago. There's evidence that went from having purely public minds to having the sense of a private mind that we wouldn't have if we stayed in our tribal situation. All right, so that is Masterclass, first one on encephalization, and we'll be going over the history of neuroscience and all types of brain functioning in the near future this summer. All right, thank you.